been tempted to stay and sit in front of the fire, but so it's good that you've braved the cold to come out, and I'm sure you won't be disappointed. Really pleased to welcome Grant Moir, Chief Executive of the National Park, to the hall tonight to give us a talk on both the past, looking back over the first 20-year life of the park, and then looking forward as to what we might be expecting to see in the years to come. It's really good, though, Grant, that you've agreed to come and give us this talk tonight. Over the years, we've had a number of people giving talks who are reflecting on the park and representing the park in different aspects of their work. I think the most recent one at the end of last season was around the beavers, and that caused some interesting question and answers at the end of the session. But I thought it was on reflection, actually, after that talk, and I thought, actually, we've never had the overview of the park and the totality of the park. So it would be good to invite Grant, and I'm really pleased that you accepted our invitation, and look forward to hearing what you have to say about the past and the future. So thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Great to be here, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you all. I realise that tonight Scotland are playing as well, so I'll try and keep you informed if there's any goals as we go along. Only if we score them, though. Obviously, if it's for the opposition, then I won't mention it at all. Also, slightly auspicious today. Today, a plaque was being unveiled down in England in Malham Cove for the 75th anniversary of the National Parks Act in England. John Dower, who was the original architect of the English National Parks, the Dower Report, was getting his own blue plaque up on the wall of Malham Cove youth hostel. So there was the great and the good were all gathered down there to look at that. So so it's 75 years today since the National Parks Act. So the national parks were sort of started down in England. So tonight I'm going to say a bit about sort of looking back over the past 20 years and then looking for the next 20, 50 years into the future, and we'll see where it takes us over that time. So this is me on the first day of being Chief Executive of the Cairngorm National Park. I've aged dreadfully in that time, but just to say a bit about me, I started here 11 years ago now as the Chief Executive of the National Park Authority, but I'm originally from Perthshire, and walking in the Cairngorms was really what I did most of my young days, and still do. I'm 12 short of finishing my Munros, so I'm sort of getting there, but this was me in front of Kiribati a long time ago in an interesting selection of clothing, I have to say, when I look at it, and I seem to be wearing two. I don't understand why I'm wearing two woolly jumpers. I'm unclear why that would be the case, but the socks I've always been especially delighted by. So that's a bit about me, and yeah, it's been my privilege to be the Chief Executive for the past decade or so, where lots has changed over that time, and obviously it's just over 20 years since the National Park was set up in the Cairngorms. So I'm just going to say a bit about where that all came from. And really, it all comes out of the Ramsay report originally. So this is 1945. National parks were one of the post-war things that were going to happen in the UK, a sort of part of the the Labour government's national renewal. Originally, it was 1931 that Christopher Addison proposed the creation of national parks in England and in Scotland, including the Cairngorms. And then following the Second World War, the 1949 Act came along, which set up the 10 national parks that are in England and Wales. The Ramsay report came out at roughly the same time, proposing 5 areas in Scotland, of which the Cairngorms was one, but they were never taken forward. The government designated them as national park direction areas, and they morphed over time into national scenic areas. There were lots of reasons why national parks didn't happen, but probably one of the key ones is around who owned the land and who sat in the House of Lords. I think was probably one of the key ones in terms of Scotland, and that was why they never happened in Scotland. So it's a very long history. There was lots of things that then happened. There was different proposals in the 1970s, and then you sort of get onto that period of time in which there's lots of conflict in the Cairngorm around lots of things. Lots of you remember these sorts of things. So there was obviously all the discussions and court cases around the extension of the ski area into the Northern Corries. There was lots of discussion around things like deer management in the Cairngorms. The future Cairngorms is the classic, which I've got a copy of by Adam Watson and Brennan Watson and Kai Curry-Liddell about the future of the Cairngorms, still a cracking little pamphlet that's worth reading. And that all sort of, I suppose, came forward in terms of a desire to try and look at the long-term management of the Cairngorms. And the bottom part, which is common sense and sustainability partnership with the Cairngorms, was the Cairngorms Working Party. The Cairngorms Working Party was set up to sort of look at how could the area be better managed to try and stop some of these conflicts from happening. So that included people like, I've got a few names here, Magnus Magnusson, Roy Dennis, Johnny Grant, David Hayes Landmark, Peter Peacock, who I think went on to become Highland Council convener, John Duff, Alistair McCook. There was quite a few others involved in that. But actually, I think one of the key things is that document, and I still go back to it quite a lot. And some of the management stuff that we have in national park plans now still flows from that same document back in 1992. There's quite a continuation in terms of what are the key challenges, what are the things we're trying to do around woodland. So I'll put on the next slide, because this is one of the maps from that document, which was public policy. This is what they came forward with in terms of woodland within the Cairngorms. This is pre-national park, the Forest of Spey and the Forest of Moir. And actually an awful lot of that is in place now. And I'll come on to woodland, but in terms of that was public policy back in 1992 to try and make this sort of thing happen. And there's been quite a movement towards some of those things. And I think some of the other things that happened during that time, I suppose, was the purchase of Moir Lodge by National Trust for Scotland back in the early 90s. That was a big moment and really a big change in terms of how that area of the Cairngorms was managed. And then I think the other bit, which is probably worth talking about, and is there was also, I suppose, one of those fights that were had was, of course, the funicular railway. A subject that I think has gone away now. Nobody ever talks about it, and that to me is one of the bonuses. But I'll just read this to you because it made me laugh the other day. A friend of mine was throwing out some stuff from his loft, and he came across, I don't know if any of you remember, the Angry Corrie. So the Angry Corrie was a sort of hill walkers fanzine from the 90s, and they had a bit on the back about the funicular, which I thought was just tremendously funny. This is not official national park policy, to be clear, nor am I speaking for the Park Authority, but what you have to realise is that the funicular is sod all to do with skiing. It's a crude attempt by Cairngorm Chairlift Company, aided and abetted by the Highland Council and diverse non-government organisations, to develop Cairngorm as a year-round attraction, primarily aimed at the coach party market, and as such a direct competitor for Annickmore Gondola. Now, I can't blame CCC for trying to make money. Up to now, they've been spectacularly good at being a non-profit organisation. I can't be too surprised about their enthusiasm for the project. No, the villains of the piece are Scottish Natural Heritage, and the runners-up are Highland Council. I just think, when you think about all the funicular discussions that we had at the time, it got quite heated, I think would be the best way I can put that in terms of, but I thought that gave you a flavour of some of the, I suppose, the controversies as to why it was felt that a national park, to try and bring some way of mediating some of these decisions within the Cairngorms, was needed in the first place. So in the year 2000, the National Parks Act came forward, and I suppose this is where it sort of is similar to what happened in England and Wales post Second World War. It was one of the first acts of the renewed Scottish Parliament, was the National Parks Act. So a bit like that sort of, if you like, the renewal of post-war Britain. This was sort of renewal stuff in terms of Scotland. And the Act came in place, and it's quite I think it's a really interesting Act. And this is what Donald Dewar said at the time. I believe that national parks are the right way forward for Scotland. The major gap we have identified in the current system of natural heritage designations relates to the management of a small number of relatively large areas of natural heritage importance. What we require in these areas is an integrated rather than sectoral approach to their management. And the aims of national parks are different to the aims of national parks in England. They're not the same. So we have 4 aims, which is conserve and enhance the natural and cultural heritage, promote sustainable use of natural resources, is to promote the understanding and enjoyment of special qualities by the public, recreation especially, and to promote the sustainable economic and social development of the area's communities, which is the key bit that's quite different to the English national parks. If there's a conflict between those aims, we have to give greater weight to the first aim, to conserve and enhance the natural and cultural heritage. So this is a picture of the original board from 2003. One of those people is still a board member, Eleanor McIntosh, who's sitting in the middle. There's still quite a lot of them still around. I think somebody's chatted about David Green previously, who's up there as well. He used to be the convener of Highland Council. So you've got an interesting board, 25 people, National Parks Act, and then it was really about here are your aims, what are you going to do? So that's, I suppose, where the story really starts about the national parks, and it's been 20 years since then. The key thing that they did early on, and the thing that the Park Authority has to do on a 5-yearly basis, is we've got to produce the management plan for the area. So it's the 5-year management plan for the national park. And that was really the key document that sets out, I suppose, that integrated management that the Donald Dewar set out. I'd also just read one other bit, which is what Andrew Thinn, who was the first convener of the national park, said in his opening remarks at the top. So they opened, hilariously, the national park at the top of the funicular. And also, I should say, on that day, there was also a rival opening of the national park on the top of Benaglow, because at that point, Atholl hadn't been included in the national park. And I'll come on to that as well in a bit of the story. So Andrew Thinn said, let me close then with this final thought. Many people seem to see the challenge of the national park in terms of land management, conservation, planning control, recreation management, business development, or visitor services. I do not believe that any of these things are inherently very difficult. I've come to the conclusion they are, but that's slightly different. The real challenge seems to me to lie in the way in which people locally and nationally think about this park and their interests in it. There's been far too much of what can I get out of this and how can I protect my interest here. What we need is a different sort of mindset for the future, one that cares about the interests of others, one that cares about society as a whole, and one that is based on common vision and reasoned compromise. These are not exactly novel concepts. But it's aspirational, I think would be the way I'd put it, but it does touch on something which is trying to say that national park is more than just the sum of its parts. It's more than just talking about visitor management or conservation or community development. It's about all those things and how they all mix together. And it's the responsibility, and I think this is one of the key things that's different between national parks in this country from a lot of them around the globe, is that it's about everyone who lives and works in the national park. There are 18 and a bit thousand people who live within the national park. There's 2.2 million visitors. It's about all those people and what that means and how we actually help to conserve and enhance what is an incredible place, and at the same time do that in a way that helps people to have livelihoods within the local area. So next up, and I promise you don't need to read all of this. This is I just have a list of things that had happened over 20 years that I thought were sort of interesting around a few of the key dates and things that happened. I'm just going to talk about the ones that are highlighted in a little bit of detail, but I could have chosen another 200 things to put on it. There's been an incredible amount, as you can imagine, that's happened over 20 years. There have been controversies, there have been lots of discussions, there's been, I tried to count how many board papers there's been, but I don't know, there must have been a fair few hundred board papers over that time as well, in terms of trying to say, what is the way to try and manage this national park? How can we involve as many people as possible in it? And people love to enjoy things that now seem, have always been there, but things like the old logging way between Aviemore and Glenmore, things like the Speyside Way extension that lets you get down to Newton Moor, all the mountain paths that have been sorted all across the Cairngorms. We've got tremendous things that are happening. But I thought I'd pick on a few individual bits from through that, which I think would be interesting. So the first one is the one that's highlighted at the top. The National Park brand is launched. Now, I've got to give credit here to Danny Alexander, and a blast from the past, but Danny Alexander was the communications manager for the National Park before he went on to much grander things as an MP and Chief Secretary of the Treasury. But he came up with the idea of having different logos for the authority, or brand for the authority and for the national park, and that the brand of the national park was for everyone to use, and was for businesses to use and for people to understand. And that was pretty novel, and it's still one of the few national parks that has that split between the Park Authority and the park. But just to give you an idea of why that has become important over the years, and don't worry, you don't need to read any of the text, but it's really the bit at the bottom, which is the importance of national park status as to why people come to a national park, and also awareness of national park status and awareness of the brand. So when we did this, we do a 5-yearly visitor survey. And you can see that in 2014-15, very important and quite important, the importance of national park status to visiting was at about 36%. By 2019-20, that had gone up to 55%. And then we're doing a visitor survey at the moment, and that's gone up to 70%. So national park status is something that attracts people, that is seen as a brand quality. And in terms of the national park brand, it's something like 50% of people who come to the national park can identify the brand without the words. So the actual bird that everyone knows is a well-known brand now in its own right. And that's up there with some very well-known brands across the UK. So it's quite interesting in terms of, that's been quite a key thing, if you like, in terms of how we take that forward. I just highlighted the John Muir Award and the Junior Rangers side of things, because these are key things that have, I suppose, been engagement right the way through the whole time. I think we're now, this was a picture down the bottom right here, is of the 10,000th John Muir Award that we did back, I think in 2009, 2010, with the kids in, I think that's a Boyne. I think we're up to over 30,000 that have gone through the John Muir Awards during that time. And then this is the Junior Rangers that are out doing path maintenance work, and we've had hundreds of kids go through the Junior Rangers programme as well. It was about engaging as many people as possible in a national park, and obviously engaging young people in all these things is a really key thing in terms of trying to create that long-term benefit to the area that we all want to see. The next one was up on the screen there previously, which was the Alt Lorgie River restoration, which was done approximately 10 years ago now. And this is just a picture of what's there now, and the person's holding up a picture of what was there before. So there's lots of rock armour to stop basically a canalised river. There was work done by the Spey Catchment Initiative with support from the Park Authority and others to remove some of that rock armour, to put woody debris into the river, to fence off quite a large area. And if you go back now, the river meanders within its own floodplain. There is natural regeneration all over the area. The amount of smolts have increased dramatically in the area as well. And what you've got overall is a really, really good project there. But it's 10 years, and this is now happening in lots of other places I'll come on to in other parts of the Cairngorms. But that was really one of the first times that we did a big river restoration project, and really showed what could be done in terms of restoring nature, but also turning back the clock and trying to make sure we've got some more natural processes rather than just where we were traditionally. One of the other things of the past 20 years has been a change in how we do ranger services. So when we were first a national park, the Park Authority did not have a ranger service, and it didn't have a ranger service all the way up to COVID. We did pay for other people to have rangers, so we paid 6 or 7 of the estates in the national park to have ranger services. But overall, there wasn't actually a coherent service across the national park. That changed during COVID and the surge of people we saw coming into the national park. So this is some of our rangers, including the 2 at the top are 2 of our trainee rangers. We take on 4 trainee rangers each year. Young folk, train them up. A lot of them go on to become seasonal rangers or get other jobs within other places. But it's a key thing for us. And across the national park, including Park Authority and partner ranger services, there's about 50 rangers in the national park doing work out there. And if you look at the amount of people that they engage with, you're talking about tens of thousands across all the ranger services. They also put out hundreds of fires, collect thousands of bags of litter, and try and make sure that the visitor management is done in a way that has the least impact on the environment and least impact on communities within the area. And I'll say a bit more about the future of that. But that was back in 2019, 2020, we started to get our own Park Authority ranger services. The next one I wanted to highlight in terms of things that have happened, this is relatively recently. So this is part of the Cairngorm's 2030 project. And this is the Outdoor Dementia Centre that was awarded a lot of money through Cairngorm's 2030 to work with Alzheimer's Scotland up at Badooish. And it's already seen hundreds of people come through the doors in terms of that. And that's really trying to do that connection with nature, has a big impact on these things, but also just the connection with nature, whether that's young people in terms of John Muir Awards, junior rangers, or right the way through to people suffering from dementia. There's a whole plethora of things that show that people engaging with nature has good things from physical and mental health. And this is something we're really glad to be involved with. We're at the start of this. It's the first year of Cairngorm's 2030. There's now 5 years of funding, and see how much we can. We think it's a world first. It's definitely first in the UK in terms of outdoor dementia centre, and then how replicable that is in other places in the UK. Because the point of this is not just to do things within the park, but to do things across the whole. See if it works, and then expand it to other places. So we're really keen on this, and I'll say a bit more about that later on as well in terms of just some of the other things we're doing around that. And then this is really, so this is the Charters Chest Path that we've just opened. So this is between Braemar and Keilach. Keilach, if any of you know, is where you park your car if you're going to climb Ben Ann. But it's the next bit, or the first bit of trying to do the Deeside Way extension as well between Ballater and Braemar. This is going from Braemar back down towards Ballater, down to the first bridge. It's taken a fair bit of work to get done. It's not been the easiest bit, but if you take this, if you take things like the Old Logging Way, if you take the Speyside Way extension, if you look at path maintenance across some of the upland paths as well, so there's been a huge investment in access routes, both between villages, around villages, and then in some of the remoter areas as well, in terms of the national park. And this one, as I say, was just opened 3 weeks ago. It's an absolutely cracking walk, all abilities as well, so people can take buggies and such like along it. And as I said, the next stage is to try and do the next bit down from Keilach down towards Crathis, and then from Crathis into Ballater as well, to the extended Deeside Way all the way from Aberdeen up to Braemar. But it gives you an indication of the sort of big things that have been happening. And I suppose during that time, it's also worth saying that there's been lots of other things happening. I mean, so I'm giving you a sort of flavour of what we've been doing in the national park, but obviously, you know, all that time there's been lots of things happening in Scotland. So we had, just as the national parks were coming to being, we had the passing of the first land reform bill into an act, and there's been 2 more land reform acts since then. So that enshrined access rights, and we're an access authority. Big issues around land management in the Cairngorms throughout this whole time. So things like deer management, grouse management, woodland expansion, raptor persecution has been an issue throughout these times as well. How all those things played out in terms of lots of discussions and changes in the Cairngorms, and I'll say a bit about that as well coming on to the future. There was also one of the big things throughout this whole time has been the issue of housing in the Cairngorms and getting enough affordable housing. It's still a big issue now. There's been over 2,000 houses built in the Cairngorms since the national park came into being. The demographics of the Cairngorms are getting older. We've got a growing elderly population. We're also having less people per household, which means we've got more individual households, which again is putting pressure on the housing stock. And we've got ever rising house prices, and at the same time, relatively flatlining wages. So housing has been a big issue. It will continue to be a big issue. But there have been quite a lot of progress in terms of building affordable homes, but we definitely need to do more. That gives you a sort of, I suppose, a canter through the past. There's lots of other things that I could say, but I'm going to sort of move on now from what's been happening to what is going to happen, hopefully, and has been happening as well. Future. So I think we all sort of know the Cairngorms because it's sort of these pictures. So we've got an incredible central core of the Cairngorms, the mountains. I mean, enough books have been written about them, whether I've been Nan Shepherd or more recently some novels and Merrin Glover and people writing about books about the Cairngorms as well. So there's lots of incredible, I suppose, history and culture surrounding the central mountains. We're then surrounded by some of the largest native woodland in the whole of the UK. some of it plantation, some of it Caledonian pine, a lot of pine woodlands, but an incredible place surrounding the mountains that's incredibly special. Places like Moir, Abernethy, out on Seafield, places like that. I should mention Alvey, since Jamie's in the audience as well. And then we've got some incredible river systems as well. Some of the few that are connected to their floodplains that are natural in their extent. And that's also something that's pretty rare in the UK. And in terms of inch marshes, we also have one of the largest inland marsh systems in the UK as well. And then further down, we've got farmland, which has been managed probably less intensively than other places in Scotland and the UK. And you still got a huge variety of different, this is a great picture of all the flowers in the fields. But the point being that there is an incredible abundance of things throughout the Cairngorm, whether that be in the straths or up into the high hills. And surrounding that, we've got some incredible wildlife, whether that be black grouse. I just like that picture really, more than anything else. I think it's a cracker. Golden eagles coming into their nest. Pine hoverfly. So this is part of a reintroduction program in the Cairngorm. Is very, very rare, and they're now being reintroduced from RZSS, are doing a pine hoverfly reintroduction program around that. And then the Spey is still one of the absolute strongholds of freshwater pearl mussels in Scotland and the UK as well. And we're just doing some final calculations on this year's survey results for the Spey. So it all looks marvellous, and the Cairngorms does look marvellous, and it's an incredible place. And you look at the high hills, look at all those pictures, think everything's spot on. But that sort of does hide some of the things that are happening in the background. So this is some work we've been doing recently about the health of different species as part of the Cairngorms Nature Index. And freshwater pearl mussel are not in great nick across the Cairngorms. There's been a 90% decline on the D. That was mainly caused by Storm Frank. And basically, when Storm Frank came in, it washed the whole river out and took them all out of the system. The same thing has happened on the Esk with one of the other storms. So you start to see the impact that climate's having in terms of the increased storms that we're having, impacting on nature. And obviously, there's also the whole thing about how freshwater pearl mussels and salmon have a relationship between each other. And these things are key. And in the Spey, we're also seeing issues around things like ranunculus in the Spey, which is an invasive species that was brought in, causing issues with some of the pearl mussel beds as well within the Spey. The overall numbers in the Spey are still doing rather well. But it's just to give an indication that everything can look well, but behind the scenes, things can not necessarily be at its absolute peak. And at the same time, we're seeing big changes in weather patterns, especially around temperature and around rainfall and around drought. And this is the period 1990 to 2019 compared to 1960 to 1989. And what you can say is, except for, of course, classically in Scotland, June getting colder, everything else, which I have to say does sum up quite a lot about being Scottish, everything else is warming at a significant rate. That's still going to happen, and that's causing us problems with, as I said, storms or longer periods of drought. We've had issues, especially in the east of the park, in terms of water supplies, especially private water supplies. That's not just in the East Park, but mainly some of the main bits in the east of the park. And the impacts of this will be felt as we go forward, because quite a lot of the climate modelling in terms of what's going to happen is already baked in. Even if we meet our targets, we do all the things we're doing, that 1.5 degree rise will have a significant impact on the Cairngorms National Park and everyone who lives within it and the nature of the Cairngorms. So if you take things like snow, these were some of we did a snow survey with JHI and others to just look at what are the potential implications of all these climate modelling on snow long-term for the Cairngorms National Park. And this is annual snow cover. And what it shows, unsurprisingly, is that there will be a significant reduction in the amount of snow in the Cairngorms. And I think we've already seen that. I mean, if you look at the past 20 years compared to the previous 20 years, there has been a reduction. It is very up and down as well. So you will still get big winters every so often, but the amount of big winters we get have been decreasing. And, I think we can all see the amount of snow that has been reducing as we're going forward. So again, that will have big impacts on the 3 snow sports centres, but it'll also have big impacts on things like river flow. Snow tends to melt quite slowly, allowing a slower release of water. If it falls as rain, if it falls as big storms, it comes much quicker, and that can cause issues. So that causes issues for things like ptarmigan, and some of things like snow bunting, dotterel, other species within the Cairngorms. But in terms of, I suppose, things closer to home, you get into flooding issues. This was just last year, in terms of looking north from sort of above Nethy Bridge, looking up towards Aviemore, causing big issues there. And this was one of the flood banks and one of the farms that was taken out by the pressure water that was coming down the Lomond and the Spey. These cause big damage, lots of expense for people, has an impact on farming, has an impact on houses in other places. And, you know, you look at Storm Frank, this was the one in Ballater back in, it's the end of 2015. This is just some of the impacts of, there was a before and after pictures of what was the caravan park, and then what was the route, the 7 bridges route that was around Ballater as well. Big impacts, and there was 300 houses were flooded out in that event as well. Since then, we've obviously had the big event in Brechin as well, which a lot of that water came down from the Angus Glens. You know, this is big impacts. It's going to increase. We, as a national park that have 4 headwaters of some of the biggest rivers in Scotland, are really key to trying to slow the flow and trying to see what we can do to make a significant difference on that. Just to say, how are we tackling the climate side of things? So where does the Cairngorms fit? So this is in the report that all the national parks got the same report done. So this is our glide path to net zero and beyond. So this is saying that if we do the things that are in the National Park Partnership Plan, how do we get to net zero, and then what happens beyond that? So in essence, theoretically, in about 2026 towards 2027, the national park crosses over and starts to become a carbon sink. So somewhere that takes in more carbon than it's putting out. That is if we do all the things that we said we're going to do. So this is to do with peatland and woodland, farming, housing, transport, etc. There's a really big report around this that sets this all out, and it's quite complicated. But the main thing for me is that somewhere like the Cairngorms has the opportunity to try and help in that overall thing of we do our bit, and Scotland does its bit, and then the UK does its bit, and then hopefully across the globe, we all try and tackle this issue. It's going to be a major thing for us. And of course, that is trying to do that in a way that is at the same time positive for nature around how we actually take that all forward. So what are some of the big changes that have happened and are happening within the Cairngorms that I think are worth talking about? So first would be there has been an expansion of woodland in the Cairngorms, quite a dramatic expansion of woodland in the Cairngorms over the past 20 years. A lot of that is being by natural regeneration, some of that's by planting as well, some of it's behind fencing, some of it's not behind fencing. There's some really good examples in the Cairngorms, whether that be at Mar Lodge, at Seafield, at Feshy and other places, of doing this without fencing, and of us taking deer numbers down in those places to do so, not without controversy, it has to be said, but direction of travel. And then just to give you an idea of where we are on the woodland side of things. So this was the woodland cover in 2002, about 14% of the Cairngorms National Park, and then by 2024 that's gone up to 19.2%. It's 23,500 hectares of woodland. Now that doesn't mean forestry, to be clear, so we're not talking about all of that being rows of woodland. That is woodland, can be open mosaics, got open land within it, but that's the change that has happened over the past number of years. The National Park Partnership Plan sets out a desire to see that number increase. I think it's, off the top of my head, by 2045, it's looking at about 1,500 hectares a year. So it's trying to get that figure up to probably about 23-24%. That is still well below what it is in most other European countries. But the point being that the National Park will still be a predominantly open landscape, but it will have more connected woodland. I think that's one of the key things And one of the things we're looking at is the corridors that can be put in place to link up some of our woodland across the national park. And that's work that's ongoing at the moment with proposed woodland and then with potential places for woodland in the future. Lots of discussions ongoing. But again, it's trying to get, one of the things that we're really keen is joining those things up. It's called nature networks. There's lots of those that we're looking to try and put in place. And it's part of that whole move to have a more, I suppose, robust and more natural system within somewhere like the Cairngorms over time. So that's sort of one aspect of things that have changed and will be changing going forward. At the same time, there's a lot of degraded peat in the Cairngorms National Park, about 52,000 hectares of degraded peat in the national park. We've restored about-ish 7,000 hectares in the last 10 years, and we've got a 38,000 hectare target for 2045. That's a huge programme of work all across the Cairngorms National Park. Just to give you, these are some of the projects, well, all the project areas except for this year's. It's not coming up too well, but you get an idea from the talks where all the peatland restoration is happening across the national park. There's a really key thing to this, which is that we've done a new entrance scheme around this. So we've helped 8 companies come through and actually start to do that for the first time. And they've gone on to become some of the contractors across the rest of Scotland as well. So it's really about trying to build up that contractor base, put some of the funding, well, funding goes back into the local economy, and we get the peatland restored whilst doing that. There's a whole load of stuff around green finance that may or may not happen around peatland restoration and woodland creation as well, which I'm not going to get into tonight, but there's an awful lot of interest in that from a whole load of different people. There are lots of different people who have lots of different opinions on it, but the key thing for me is trying to make sure that we do the right job on the ground in restoring our peatlands. And if you look at some of the pictures, so this was a before and after, and one of the that's before the peatland restoration work was done. You can see some of the different bits, and then you can see the work that was done after the ditch blocking and some of the work. And in terms of sort of more close-up picture, again, this was a before picture and an after picture in terms of the work that's done in terms of drainage. So peatland restoration is a big part of what we're doing now, but it's going to be a big part of what we do over the next 25 years. There's a team within the Cairngorms who work with land managers across the whole of the Cairngorms. And I suppose the key thing I should sort of make clear on that is the Park Authority owns no land within the Cairngorms National Park. Not a single parcel of land is owned by the Cairngorms National Park Authority. It is all done in partnership with people who own the land, whether that be NGOs, whether it be private landowners, whether it be farmers, whether it be others. And it's all done, it's not a regulatory thing. We can't force people to do peatland restoration. We can't force people to do anything. We work in partnership. We try and make sure the right things happen in the right place. Some of that happens quite easily. Some of it takes a bit of time. But I suppose it is that negotiation over time. And one of the key reasons why Park Authority is put in was that long-term management and trying to make things happen in partnership. And that goes as well on the farming side. We do a lot of work with farmers. We're doing more of that. So we've got an interesting project through the Cairngorms 2030 side of things called the Future Farming Project. That's working with 6 farms across the national park to look at different options that they have on biodiversity side, on the carbon side of things, but also most importantly, and then looking at the bottom line to try and see how we make that profitable within the system that people actually work with. And then hopefully if we have learnings out of that, we can then show that out to other people within the national park. We've got things like goose management schemes within the national park at the moment. I think there's been, just over 700 grey-lag geese that have been done through that scheme, and we work with people on a whole range of things individually on different parts. So I think there's more that we can do on the farming side, but there's some really good work happening there with individuals all across the national park. And then the next part, just talking about river restoration and the work that we're doing around that, because again, I mentioned previously Alt Lorgie. I feel like that was not a trial, but it was, I suppose, it was the first of these sorts of things within the national park. Where we are now is that this is happening at scale all across the national park. The Rivery Dee Trust have their Million Tree campaign in the Dee, and they're also putting in woody debris structures all up and down the Dee in its tributaries. This is happening Glenbannicher and other places up and down the Spey as well. And this is really about trying to create more natural systems. And one of the main reasons for this is around salmon fishing. So I think, as you may know, salmon start to struggle when temperatures in water get up into the 20s. And one of the main ways to try and reduce that is by creating deeper pools, and obviously woody structures do that, but also by planting riparian woodland to provide shadow into the rivers. And we need to do that because one of the tributaries of the Dee was, I think it was 28 degrees it was found to be. Now that is way above what you would normally find in cold water. Now I'm not saying that's normal, but the point being that with the climate models we've got, we're going to have to make sure we're doing things now to protect things for the future and to make sure we're not too late about some of these things. So it's really key that we keep on going with the river restoration side as well. And then that obviously leads on to beavers. You've already done beavers in this talk before, so I'm not going to talk too much about them. But obviously one of the key things with that is the beavers have the opportunity to do some of the things that are being done by humans at the moment, like woody debris, and to see how they act in a more natural system over the next few years. And we've now just finished our second tranche of releases into the national park this year, with the final ones being released into Loch. And so that leads on to sort of one of our big targets. So this is it's a map, and you could cut it in different ways. But what we've got is we've got a target by 2045 that at least 50% of the park will be managed principally for ecosystem restoration. We estimate that's about 27% at the moment. So there's a lot of work to be done. You could probably cut that in different ways, in different bits. And we'll be working with people all across the national park to try and increase that and try and make sure that we do as much as possible to meet the climate targets, our biodiversity targets, but also do that in a way that is good for people and livelihoods within the local area. And that brings me, I suppose, nicely onto the sort of big programme that we're taking forward, which is called Cairngorm's 2030, People and Nature Thriving Together. And this is really about trying to look across all these different things, whether that be community development. It's got Your Future Here up on the screen. Your Future Here was held in Aberdeen Resort about a month and a half ago. Over 300 young people looking at what the opportunities were in terms of jobs and skills within the local area, the jobs that are available in the future, and talking to loads of businesses about all their opportunities. Lots of good stuff came out of that. I talked a bit about the Alzheimer's Centre, but the point about the other part of that is we're doing a lot of work with NHS in terms of green prescriptions. So all the GP surgeries now actually have a button on their system that they can press, and somebody can get a nature prescription, which then gets linked in with our Green Health Link worker, and then they get put into things like health walks, other opportunities, things that they can do within the area to benefit from nature, as well as the more normal way that people prescribe things within GP surgeries. And again, replicable, how can we do that in other places as well? And then we've got things like the Spin project in Aviemore, and that's getting more people out on their bikes, but also giving people maintenance classes and all these sorts of things to try and get them more confident with bikes. That's just one example of it, but it's trying to link all these things together about nature, about health, about the environment we're in. If we have a healthy environment and we have healthy people, there will be big benefits for society down the line. If you think about how much we spend at the moment on the NHS in this country, how we do things, we're going to have to change. We're going to have to try and make sure we actually have a healthier population so that we have less pressure on NHS. These are the sorts of things we're trying to do in terms of encourage people to do those sorts of things. So it's a big programme. It's got 21 projects in it. The Cairn magazine you get through your door every sort of 4 months or so, usually there's something in about that, but there's lots of projects in there and lots of things to get involved with. There'll be a community managed grant scheme coming along, which is about £1.5 million, which will be designed and done by the communities about the sorts of things that they want to see communities want to happen within communities. We're looking at things like citizens' juries involved in that as well, in terms of how we can get more people involved and not just the usual suspects, and actually get down to what people actually want to see happen in their own communities. And lots of big transport projects as well, and they're trying to improve public transport and also trying to improve the active travel network. So there's a ton of stuff in that. It's all very people focused. At the back of that is the people focus, but within that wider nature and climate envelope that I was sort of speaking about previously. And then we get on to I suppose the key thing for me is that this is not about being done unto or trying to talk about how national parks are all about nature and anything else. It's very easy to set up almost all these discussions as environment versus economy, or people against nature, whatever it might be. I don't think it's a very good way of looking at anything, but it always makes a good story, usually in the media, to tell you the truth, in which they say, we'll get a quote from somebody and get a quote from somebody else, and then they can have a rammy about it, and somehow that helps us all. Generally, it doesn't. Actually, we've got to think about these things collectively. We're all part of where we live. As I said, there's 18 and a bit thousand people living in the Cairngorms National Park. What we're doing within the villages is just as important as outside, and that's why we spend so much time and effort on the community development side of things. That's why we put quite a lot of support into things like voluntary action, Badminton, Spey, all the community action plans, how that flows into the local development plan. We do the same on the other side of the Moir area partnership. And I think it's really, really important that we get that balance right between what we're doing in terms of that big landscape scale stuff within the park, what we're doing with the villages. Haven't really touched on all the visitor management stuff tonight, but that's a whole other area that we get involved with. That's obviously pretty key to how we work. But the bit I just wanted to sort of finish with is about housing. It is a really critical issue. We've done quite a few things that are a bit different, I suppose, in the Cairngorms. So across Scotland, the average is that you have to do 25% affordable housing in the development. Within 4 villages in the Cairngorms, in the back of the last local development plan, it's now 45%. So that's higher than, I think, any of the other parts of Scotland at present. We have an aspiration to take that up to 75% by 2030. There's a lot of different work to be done on that, but it's absolutely crucial that we get more affordable housing for people who live and work here. That does have the flip side to it, which is that we also have a lot of holiday homes and second homes within the Cairngorms National Park, and obviously we've had the short-term let control area put in by Highland Council within Spey and Trossach. Other places are looking at some of those as well, and we need to get that balance right. It's not saying that there shouldn't be any holiday homes or second homes. That's not what we're saying, but there needs to be a balance between the ability for people to actually find a home, live here, work, and people being able to come into the area and buy a house and all the rest of it. It's really, really complicated. If there was a simple answer to it, we would have done it. There is an issue with housing all across the UK, all across Scotland, but if we can try and find different ways to make things happen. This was just an example of, this is the community housing that's been done up in Tow. So this was taken forward by the Tow Community Development Trust. And the reason that I want to say a bit about that is because I think it shows you something about where the Park Authority works and some of this stuff. So what you'll see is that's been done by the Tow Community Development Trust. Great. But who helped to set up the Community Development Trust? Well, that was the Park Authority, along with Highlands and Isles Enterprise and along with Moray Council behind the scenes. And who's helped to fund that Community Development Trust for the past decade with a bit of money each year to try and keep it going, as it's taken over things like the visitor centre, as it's taken over the youth hostel, as it's taken on some of the camping side of things, and as it's done housing. Now, they've done amazing work, but without the actual in the background bit of supporting some of these things, and that happens all across the national park, these things wouldn't happen either. So it's sometimes quite easy. I was thinking, what does the national park actually do? What does the National Park Authority do? What do those people in that building sit and do all day? Because it's that classic sort of thing. So I can point to things like rangers and say, well, they're out there doing that sort of stuff. Or I can point to the conservation team and say they're out doing all the stuff I talked about. But there's also a lot of people doing this sort of stuff behind the scenes and keeping things going, and making sure that community action plans have the funding to be able to actually happen within villages, and trying to make sure that all the things that people hopefully appreciate, things like access paths, all our rangers are out making sure that they're all in good nick. We're then investing in it. We're about to invest in some redesign work on the old logging way. We're looking to take out some of the gates across some of the parts of the Speyside Way that drive me absolutely batty. I mean, it's seriously insane on my bike usually. And working with people to do those sorts of things. It's all of that is that I suppose to go right the way back to that original stuff that Andrew Thinn talked about and that Donald Dewar talked about, and right the way back to the 1945. It's about the integrated management of all of that. None of these things are easy. There's no right decisions in this. I mean, whenever we do a planning meeting, there's no doubt 50% of people think that's a good decision, and 50% of people think, why on earth did they decide that? Because that's usually how it works in a village when you're making a decision on these things. But all we can say is that the board and the people who work for the board in terms of the staff are trying their best to do the long-term good for the national park. We don't always get the answer right, and hopefully we correct it when we don't do that. But it's really key that we have that long-term vision, which is what the park plan gives us out to 2045, and that there's really good opportunities for everyone to get involved in that. And you even just need to look at something like the fire management bylaws that we've been consulting on. 1,600 people responded to that. Now, that's a lot of people. I mean, you look at national consultations, they've got anywhere near that. We went out and talked to so many people about whether we should do this or not. It's quite a big thing for us to put in a bylaw. We've never done it before. And the overwhelming majority of people were in favour of doing something about that and actually saying, you know what, fire during the summer season is not a good idea. There are other ways for people to do that, and we want to see that come to an end. So that's what we're doing. We're taking forward that fire management bylaw. But the point being that that's because you've got a local organisation that's able to listen to these things, able to come up with what might be the right solutions, and to then implement it on the ground. And I think that's the key thing in terms of national parks. Yes, we get an amount of money from Scottish Government each year, but we then use that to lever in lots of other money. So our core grant and aid this year is at about £8 million. Our total budget is about £16 million because we bring in lots of other funding from other places to do things, whether that be National Water Heritage Fund, there'll be other funding sources to try and make things happen on the ground. And if you're really mad about something that's happening, then you can always stand for election every 4 years. There's always an opportunity for people to do that and to get on the board and make a difference. And, there's lots of other opportunities for people to get involved. I always say that we've now got 80 volunteer rangers that I think that setting aside the volunteer rangers, I think volunteers put in something close to 5,000 hours into just National Park Authority type volunteering opportunities across the national park this past year. As I said, the volunteer ranger side of things, there's people always volunteering in all the community type stuff across the national park. And I suppose it doesn't work unless everyone chips in. That's the key thing. National parks aren't just about the staff in a building in Grantown or a few people. It's about everyone who lives and works in them and how we all work together. And if we do that, I genuinely think the challenges that we have can be met, whether that be climate, nature, housing, economic development, all the things Andrew Thin listed out that he said were easy to solve, which are still not entirely solved and never will be, because there's always another challenge that comes up. But I hope tonight you get a sort of taste of some of the stuff that we're involved in as National Park Authority. Thank you for your time this evening, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grant. That was fascinating.
Just to say, it's 1-0 to Scotland. 1-0 to Scotland. And it's John McGinn in the 3rd minute. So I'm very happy. It's a miracle.
That's pretty impressive, isn't it? I was just thinking then, there's a phrase, wasn't there? What did the Romans ever do for us that people used to sort of quiver about? And toward the end of there, I was thinking, what did the National Park ever do for us? And I think you've answered that really well tonight, and just going through the whole plethora of initiatives and activities that the park has been involved with and intends to continue to be involved with. So thank you very much for that. Do people have questions that they want? I mean, I've got several, but I don't want to hog them. Yeah.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the talk, by the way. It's very interesting. Fantastic work that the authority does on the sequestration side of the climate emergency. And it was always very interesting, to see the graph that we put up about, that the park itself hasn't actually reached the point of net zero yet, where we're actually starting to be that carbon sink that Scotland needs, that UK needs, that the world needs, which is one of the things I just want to ask for is there more that you could be doing in terms of the other side of the net zero equation, dealing with the carbon emissions that are produced in the national park? I was reading the report that graph came from, and I've got 30 years of gut instinct in these things. I've worked with companies on reducing energy for many years, and I was quite shocked that the carbon footprint of visitors, residents, businesses in the national park is as high as over 600,000 tonnes a year, and that I assume that the sequestration element of that would be, would far outweigh how much it generates. And the report does suggest that on average we produce more emissions than the average UK citizen, and there's lots of good reasons for that. But so that's one reason we're asking the question: could more be done? The other reason is a more specific local issue where you may be aware that the sawmill, ESW sawmill, closed down, and there was that was a vacant site for almost a couple of years, and we put together a proposal for a community energy, community sector economy hub, essentially for that site. And we did, we came at it a little bit late in the day, so we perhaps didn't have enough time for, the full community consultation and consultation with yourself. But we were disappointed that we pitched this towards yourselves just to see if we could get some support, and not asking for monetary support, but support that would help us to your proposal, and we didn't get any reply at all. And again, it's not criticism, and I guess you're potentially under-resourced.
Okay, can I just, I think there are two questions.
Is there more we could do on reducing emissions from visitors, businesses, residents?
Okay, so can I just, for the benefit of people on YouTube, so I just summarise, I think what you're asking about is, the ability to reduce the carbon footprint, particularly by our daily activities in the park, and then there's a supplementary around the future of the old sawmill site locally.
Yeah, but yes, I mean, the answer is there's lots more we can do. The question is, how much are people willing to change behaviour around some of that? So you think about, we get, as I said, 2.1 million visitors coming to the national park. Most of those, 90% above, come by car, and most people get around by car. Now, are we going to change how most people get here? Probably not. There'll be some change in that over time, but probably not in the grand scheme of things. When people get here, though, how they move around the national park, we can change some of that. We can make it easier for people to do that by actually decent public transport in certain places. We can look at active travel. There are other things we can do. There's obviously lots of stuff that can be done in terms of housing, in terms of reducing emissions around that. Some of those things are at the national scale rather than stuff we can do at the park authority side of things. But yes, there's lots more that we can do. And I suppose that's how fast we can move. And some of the stuff that we're doing through Cairngorm 2030 is climate conscious communities type stuff, and how we can do that. So the answer is always yes, we can do more. The other question is, how fast are people willing to move on some of that stuff as well, because that's changing behaviours, and that's quite a deep thing. But there are some quite big projects coming up that I hope will help to do some of that. I don't know anything about a community bid in terms of, but if you want to write to me about the community side of things for the boat garden site, but I mean, more than happy to chat through the sawmill site. It'll be one of the
site has now been sold, and it's likely to be more whisky infrastructure rather than. I suppose the only reason I'm raising it is because there was a missed opportunity for a potentially, carbon reducing project around, community energy, community circular economy, etc. And it's not to be missed, and it will, will be some whisky warehouses or whatever, and that will generate some jobs. But the idea behind it also. Sorry.
Okay, no, thanks for that. That's important. Yeah, Peter. Yeah.
I wonder how why you set a target of 35,000 hectares of new woodland by 2045, what your sort of factual basis for the 35,000 is. Secondly, up to what height are you assuming that there will be forestry? And the third element is, how are you going to achieve it?
Well, we have been achieving that target. So if you take the past 10 years, we've been hitting what would take you to that point. going forward. So we've been doing, roughly speaking, about 1,500 hectares a year in the Cairngorms. Roughly 1,500 hectares new woodland per annum in the Cairngorms for the past 10 years, give or take. So we know we can do that level. There's all different types of woodland. So in terms of, there's not a maximum height, because some of the stuff we'll be doing is montane woodland, maybe montane scrub, maybe montane willows. We're not talking about all of it being timber for forestry. Some of this will be mosaic, some of it will be bog woodland. So we're not saying that there's a height, because if you look at some of the stuff in terms of what's happening around Treac and other places, we've got trees stretching up to 2,600, 2,700 feet. They're not woodland, there's not going to be timber, but in terms of for biodiversity and stuff, there's some fantastic stuff happening at those sorts of heights as well. So I think it is actually quite deliverable. And in essence, what we did was we looked at previous trends and we looked at where we're looking in terms of woodland corridors. And that's how the target was taken forward back 3 or 4 years ago when we was in that.
Yes, yeah.
Can I just come back to this net carbon zero?
Yep.
Now, obviously, it's a global problem we've got with climate change. If we want to get to net carbon zero, we can import everything we consume and export everything we discard.
Yep.
We've therefore got to look at it and be more sensible and say, well, if we're importing so much of our, we import 81% of all our forest products, and a lot from less sustainable areas than we are, and also putting far more carbon into the atmosphere. So why don't we concentrate on producing more of what we consume ourselves? And exactly the same with food. We used to be 80% self-sufficient in food. We're now down to 60% and dropping. Would we not be better to concentrate on being more self-sufficient in the food we produce and also in the energy we produce, rather than creating a pretty landscape?
Yeah, I think there's, Jimmy, I don't disagree with you on some of those things, but I think it's worth rounding all those things out. So yes, we import 81% of our timber, and I think we could do a lot more about that. I suppose that's some of the stuff that we're talking about in the Cairngorms. I think we consume 19% of our lamb, I think, roughly speaking. We export the rest. And we use half of our arable land for whisky production. So when we talk about food security, when we talk about food, it's not just about looking at one thing. It's about looking at all these things and how they all fit together. Now, there are good reasons why we do those things. So that's not to say that's bad. I'm just saying that we often get one side of those discussions, and we need to think about it holistically. Are we using the arable land that we have, which is relatively limited in Scotland, for the things we should be using it for, if you're wanting to try and increase food security? That's a good question. Who do we pay the money to in terms of, if you are an upland farmer, you get paid a lot less per hectare than if you're in good agricultural land in the lowlands. That's a political choice as well. So there's lots of things around that that's worth thinking about. And I think that's where some of the big discussions around land use change, agriculture payments, all these sorts of things will come forward in the future. But I agree, we can't just export our issues to other places. We've got to try and think about how we can do the best we can within Scotland, the UK, Cairngorms, and it's not just about a pretty picture, absolutely not. It's about trying to make these living landscapes that actually people can make a living from, because ultimately that's what we want and need. We can't just have somewhere that is just about it being nice. That's not good enough.
If we all became vegetarian, that would have a huge impact on CO2 emissions.
Oh, blimey, there's
Well,
a whole, that's only up a can of worms. I'm not getting into that.
I think that's a sensible question. Yeah.
As farmers are very much in the news at the moment, what can you do to actively help them instead of our government being determined to make it very difficult for them?
Well, thank you for that easy question. I was hoping. I suppose it's worth saying that, taxation policy at UK level is well above my pay grade. It's not something that's even set at Scottish Government level. This is a UK government decision around inheritance tax rates. Some of it is quite complicated. Some of it I don't understand yet, and I'm still trying to get to the bottom of it. I was having a conversation with Jamie about it when we came in about some of the stuff around that. I think what we've got to try and do is support farming to deliver the right things within the Cairngorms, to help support farmers that are doing that, and to do what we can to support them in their businesses. As I said, we want to see people making a livelihood in the Cairngorms that are farming the Cairngorms, whether that be tenants or owners. And that's quite complicated at the moment, and seeing how the difference goes. We will not get into things like inheritance tax. That is not something that a National Park Authority would get
You
into.
mentioned in one of your statements that you can't compel anybody to do anything. Is that really true?
Yes, we have no regulatory power over land management at all. So outside of access, where we're the access authority, so the only time we've used anything, I suppose, regulatory is that we put a path through Kinrara that the landowner didn't want for the Speyside Way. So that was the first path order in Scotland, was used by the Park Authority with Minister's sign-off. So that was one part. And then obviously planning is the other part. So if somebody wants to build something, then if it's something the Park Authority calls in, we have something to do with that. But outside of that, if you are a landowner that wants to do something, we tend to work with people, advise, try to make things happen, sometimes use some funding, but it's not a regulatory relationship. That's a pretty key thing.
Yes, yes.
I'd like to go back to net zero. When I first read about it in the Care magazine, I was quite puzzled by it, so I dug into it. And I actually think the way it was spun in Care was not good, because it seemed to, we're boasting, we are going to be the first net zero national park. And when you look at it, it's largely because we've got all this area of peatland. And I sort of thought, well, okay, right, the park's going to be net zero. I can forget about my decision never to fly again, and I can use as much carbon as I want. And I think you explained it much more clearly and much more holistically. But I think there is a real danger of things like we're the first net zero national park.
Yeah, I take your point. So it's definitely not about, when we get to the point where the park theatre is net zero, for Scotland to be net zero, we need to go much further than net zero, because we need to become a carbon sink, which is why we're doing all that peatland work. And that goes for other places, so whether full country and other places in terms of that sort of thing. So it's not about stopping. I suppose it gives us a good way into discussing it with people around some of those things. So it just happens to be that of the 15 UK national parks, the Cairngorms gets to net zero first. I think South Downs, from my memory, is about 2050, just because of the amount of people and people who go through it, people live within it and people go through it and all the stuff in terms of South Downs. So there's quite a range within the national park family, but it's absolutely not about we get to net zero and go, hey, job done. No, actually, job just starting. There's a whole load of stuff to go. So if we haven't quite nailed the messaging around that, then happy to take that back. Yeah.
Can I just, you mentioned we've got over 2 million visitors each year coming in. What are you projecting visitor numbers for 20 years or 10 years or in the future? And what's the optimum, have we already exceeded the optimum number, or what is it? How many visitors can we accommodate without it conflicting with the conservation and the ecology side?
So the optimum number is really difficult to say. So I'm not going to pretend that there's a magic number that says that if it gets above 2.3 million, it's the end of the world. And if we, I don't think that exists. What we have got in the park plan is we are not trying to increase visitor numbers. No. So what we are wanting people to do is to have people who stay longer and spend more, better economically, but not just have more people for the sake of it. And what we have said is we are trying to increase the shoulder seasons to make it more year round rather than just. And actually, we've just done our first bit of work on that. And so that's been something we've been at about 3 or 4 years. And we've done the difference between 2019 and 2023. And at the moment, it's showing, and I don't have the figure, I've got it somewhere in here, but I don't have the figure in front of me. It's showing that we've basically flatlined in the summer months, and we've seen I think it's a 20% increase in the shoulder months in the winter. So we are starting to see that movement, which is what we wanted. We wanted tourism to not just be something which has seasonal jobs, but it's year round. And that if we can try and do more of that, and that's been working with the Cairngorms Business Partnership and many others, it's not just a Park Authority thing. But for instance, we're doing a winter campaign again this year, which is marketing around the winter side of things. We don't do any marketing during the summer season, because that's what we're trying to do. Obviously, individual businesses do, because that's their life. But But no, our overall projection is not to try and have more visitors. It's trying to get the visitors who come to spend more, stay longer, enjoy the place, and to have that wider spread across the.
And do you want them to focus on the honeypots, or would you rather see them spread across the area? And because you can manage and control it perhaps if they're all in the same congested honeypot spots, and you can conserve the environment if that's less well tramped.
Yeah, I suppose that's two different sides of my brain on that one. So yes, we want to spread it further than just the classic honeypot sites, in terms of there is capacity in other places in the national park that you could have more visitors, that would not impact on infrastructure, that would be good for those places because there would be more economic potential around some of those things. From a visitor management point of view, having them all in certain places probably does make it easier to manage those honeypot sites. So if I know where people are likely to light fires, I can then target ranger resource or police resource at those things. But they're probably slightly different things. You can probably try and spread more people around without trying to spread around some of the stuff that happens in some of the more popular places. But yeah, there's a bit of tension in those two things. I don't know if there's a perfect answer, but that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, to carry on with that, if you've had input into affordable housing and that sort of thing, which is fine for people with permanent jobs, but to go to your seasonal jobs, have you any plans to create a type of accommodation that could be available for seasonal workers? For example, in Aberdeen, I know there's great difficulty getting staff in hospitality. Is there any plan to do something for the likes of seasonal workers?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because, so we're not the housing authority, and we don't build housing. We grant permissions. People come to us to ask for permission for things, whether they say yes or no, and then we can work with certain people to try and get the right sort of stuff built. There has been discussion around some of those things, around things like key worker houses, some of the seasonal side of things. I know the CBP worked on, so there's the work that the Cairngorm Business Partnership have done, which is looking at allocating housing to people who are members through certain criteria and all these sorts of things. So it is being looked at. It is tricky, and you're right, some of the, I suppose, the traditional seasonal side of things is no longer there. They've changed into other things. But housing, and it is one of the key things, is trying to get the right housing for the sort of workforce you have. And because ultimately, and you can build and sell quite expensive houses in the Cairngorms, and that's not necessarily what we need. We need more down at I don't mean lower end, cheaper end, but we need stuff that's affordable for people who are on wages of 30,000-40,000 quid, not another house that you need a deposit of 70 or 80 grand to be able to buy a 400,000, 500,000 pound house. That's not anything that will help us do things within the Cairngorm. So it's a very difficult issue.
Any? Yeah, in the back.
Grant, how could we have more serious input into consultations? You know yourself, objective, for example, we've got the beavers here, 188 people from within the national park voted for that. The other one that was bit of 6 now is the Blackrock Forest. We discussed this the other day as well. How do we get more input into that to actually make a change as a community?
Can I just repeat that for the? The question is, how do we get more meaningful involvement in consultation engagement? Just so folks down here. Thanks.
Yeah, I suppose there's two different bits to that. I can absolutely. Obviously, there are a range of opinions on beavers. I don't think there's any doubt of that. As I said, there was a debate in here not that long ago. I would say that there was probably a different opinion on that. I think there was a lot of consultation on that. We don't necessarily agree on it, but there was a lot of consultation and discussion and engagement. And I think we do have to sometimes recognise that consultation and agreement are not necessarily the same thing. We can consult people, we can have a discussion with something, but we might still do something that you don't agree with. I suppose that's the way it goes. The Muckrock Forest one, I think, is slightly different in that it was a Scottish Forestry thing, not a park authority directly. I do think there is something about how people get involved in forestry consultations, which I think are slightly, people tend to hear about planning stuff because it's happening in the village. people tend to not hear about forestry stuff, which can have quite a big impact on areas. And I think one of the things we've been discussing with Scottish Forestry is certainly how we can make that more high profile when these things do come around, so that people know about it. Because I think it is something that, compared to planning, most people don't really pay any attention to what's on the forest list in terms of any given month, but it can have a big impact on places. And so that's something we've discussed with Scottish Forestry. I think they're keen to try and do that, and I think they are revising their whole system around how they do that going forward. But certainly, if one of the things we are looking at is whether we put something out to notify people when there's a forestry consultation coming along of a big scale. I mean, there's obviously very small ones that don't make a lot of difference to people, but something big and new where it's a big change in land use, because I think it is something people should get involved with.
Are we done? Is that good? Oh, yeah. Go on.
Yeah, sorry. This sort of feeds into what your man communal benefits, trying to get to net zero and all of that. Surely, if there's 2 million people coming into the park, and they're all coming in by car, or mostly coming in by car, there's nothing you can really do about that. Could you not set up like a similar to like a green zone in Glasgow and Edinburgh where they get a carbon toll on their way in, and suddenly that toll is paid towards communal benefits of, regenerative energy and things like that are more pay into the national park rather than they come in, they leave, there's nothing really left behind.
But you got to be a bit careful with nothing really left behind, because the Cairngorm's economy gets about £400 million a year from tourism. So we've got huge amount of people. I mean, it was about 40% are directly employed in tourism. If you take probably trades and things like that, it probably increases quite a bit more in terms of people who are behind that. So in terms of tourism, does provide a big economic boost. However, your point about what's left behind and what are our options for things like people coming by car, I agree. We're going to have to think boldly about some of these things. I suspect things like green zones, I've not really thought about that. I need to go and have a think about whether that sort of thing works. But the point about community benefit from some of these things, I mean, there's a thing called, and you get all this jargon, but community wealth building. But the basis of it is, how can you try and get more wealth to stay within local communities? How can you try and get things that actually means that the wealth builds up with places, it's not just taken out and extracted? And that goes for things like green finance stuff. We'll make sure it doesn't all just disappear if that does happen. How do we make sure that people benefit from renewables? If there's going to be a Bewley Denny type thing, well, how do people close to that actually benefit from these things? So that community benefit side has certainly come up the agenda, and it's something that needs far more thought about how, in the long run, the people who live and work within the area benefit from some of these things that maybe have traditionally gone and disappeared out of the area relatively quickly. So that's a good point.
Okay. Sounds like it's a good point to draw things to a close. So thanks. I mean, I feel very optimistic. I think we're all privileged and really fortunate to live in such a fantastic place. And I think what you've described in terms of the ambitions of the park are really quite positive and good in terms of the prospects going forward. So thank you very, very much for coming along and sharing your thoughts with us tonight. And it's obviously been well received in terms of the range of questions that we've had. So it's a great night. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Let's celebrate the second Scotland goal in Aberdeen.
Has it come yet?
I don't know.
Thank you. Back here in a fortnight's time when Peter Mackay will be talking to us about Scotland's most remarkable woman, Lady Hamilton. So I think it'll be a really interesting talk to come to for our mince pie evening. If you have a cup with you in the hall, please could you take it back out? And a few people to stack some chairs would be very well received. Thank you all very much.